much for coming out today. My name is Jessica Stanton. I'm an associate professor of global public policy in the Humphrey School. We welcome you here today if you're coming from outside of the university. Thanks so much for coming. So we're very lucky today to have two esteemed panelists who are going to speak a little bit at first about nuclear issues related to North Korea. But we're going to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience and discussion with the panelists. So we hope that you'll contribute to the discussion and ask them your questions. I'll just start by introducing them, and then we'll turn to their comments, and then I'll moderate questions after. So first we have John Rash, who is an editorial writer and columnist for the Star Tribune here in Minneapolis. He writes a weekly column called the Rash Report, which focuses on a wide range of issues, but often focuses on foreign policy. So if you're interested in foreign policy issues, I encourage you to check that out. And he's done reporting trips around the world, and as I said, writes quite frequently on foreign policy issues. So he's going to talk to us from that perspective today about some of the reporting that he's done on foreign policy issues and some of the contacts and discussions that he's had with various people who work on these kinds of issues from that perspective. I'll also say that he's a graduate of the University of Minnesota, so glad to welcome him back here. And I believe he's taught classes here as well. And then we also have Professor Mark Bell, who's an assistant professor in the political science department here at the University of Minnesota. And Mark is an expert on issues related to nuclear weapons and nuclear policy. He's currently working on a book on thinking about how states' policies change after they acquire nuclear weapons. So certainly very relevant to our discussions today. And he's published a number of articles in various academic journals and other outlets on issues related to nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation, and nuclear policy. So I encourage you to check that out as well. So I'll leave it at that, and I will turn to John Rash to get us started, and then we'll turn to Mark Bell after that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all very much for being here and for the honor of coming back to my alma mater, where I was fortunate enough to study political science and French here and teach in the journalism school for 13 years, including a course on mass media and politics, which we would have to toss the textbook away if we were in this era, and I were still teaching it at this point, but a busy home life with a couple of kids is keeping me running, so I haven't been on campus as much, so it's great to be back here. And I really appreciate being included on what I think and hope will be a compelling panel today, particularly with your really well-formed questions that'll soon be coming, so I'm going to try and keep my comments brief, particularly because while I'm sitting here with experts, I am not an expert. It's my job to ask questions of experts, which I get the great honor to do on behalf of the Star Tribune and focusing on foreign policy with my column and editorial writing. And in doing so, quite often my reporting will reflect events that happen, that we feel that we have to editorialize about, or that I think will make for a gripping column topic for that particular week. But beyond the individual events, these themes keep reoccurring. And part of it is that there are multiple nuclear crises concurrently happening around the world. And I think that it's incredibly important, of course, to focus on Pyongyang and what's happening in Northeast Asia, but North Korea is not the only nuclear proliferator or a nation or even non-state that is indeed threatening to do so. So while there's a lot of global focus on North Korea and the theocracy in Tehran and their potential nuclear program, it certainly isn't limited to that. There are some of the focus, of course, involves countries that have previously proliferated. And so when you talk to foreign policy experts, as I get the opportunity to do, a very common response to them on the classic "what keeps you up at night" response involves Pakistan and their deep concern about the instability in that part of Asia, about the never-ending conflict with India, and about how the dynamics in Afghanistan come into play as well. And of course, with Pakistan being a nuclear state and not always seemingly having their nuclear arsenal secured, that is something that is of grave concern although it doesn't grab the headlines in the same way that Iran and North Korea do at this point. And then, of course, some of the crises involve geopolitical superpowers who proliferated generations ago. And I think, in particular, with everyone here who was thinking about coming and hearing comments today regarding this issue, and who picked up the paper, thank you for doing that, by the way, as well as listened to the radio or checked your online news feed and heard the news out of Moscow regarding President Putin and his promises to his people in the midst of a foregone conclusion re-election campaign about Russia's arsenal being impervious to missile defense systems that NATO nations have concentrated on also for generations, really shows some of the stakes that come into play even with countries that already have weapons. And I think that beyond talking about North Korea and Iran and elsewhere, we're going to be talking a whole lot about this country and our nuclear posture as well. Something, of course, we already were doing in terms of some of the ambitious plans the Trump administration has talked about since they came into office, and some of the equally ambitious costs that, as positioned to me by Joe Cirincione, who is, some of you, perhaps most of you perhaps know, as head of the president of the Plowshares Fund, a non-proliferation organization out of Washington. He was in our office relatively recently talking about the $1 trillion plan to upgrade and to modernize nuclear weapons in this country. And he said this is going to go beyond a guns and butter debate and become a guns and guns debate, meaning not only what can we not afford to do from a social program perspective, but what can we not afford to do from the Defense Department perspective. And it looks like it's going to be that costly if indeed they move forward. And this was prior to President Putin's comments today regarding Moscow's arsenal. Of course, some involve, as we're all aware, non-state actors like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, who are quite willing to use a dirty or a clean or somewhere in between bomb at any time to continue their campaign of terror, which has become the central geopolitical dynamic, at least in terms of this nation and its response over the last few presidential administrations. And I think it's important to note that all of these dynamics come amid a time of spiraling crises worldwide, of a general sense or certitude of global drift, and even those who find some positive merits in the administration would say comes at a time when the administration seems at minimum unfocused and at maximum incapable of contending with these crises at the same time. So it really comes at a really dangerous and precarious geopolitical moment that's happening here. And I guess I would conclude before I turn it to a fellow panelist here, and to say that something one gets used to when one reports and speaks to experts is people, myself included, probably all of us to a certain degree, get very focused on the subject that you become expert on or that you study, and it's easy to have a sense of alacrity about those particular topics. This is the one topic that seems underhyped, and I hear this from expert after expert in terms of how the clear and present danger of one, if not several, of these different dynamics becoming a true national and indeed international crisis at some point. And then the American public, seems really unable or unwilling to acknowledge at this point. So I think and I hope that forums like this, that news events coming from around the world, Russia in particular today, focus some attention, because I think that this is an issue, however people had hoped, had subsided in the public's consciousness, which I think is about to rise again. So, thank you.
Mark?
Great. Well, thank you all for coming. So, I mean, those of us who study nuclear weapons issues, I think it's always sort of a bad sign for the world when people are interested in what we have to say. But nonetheless, it's good that people are interested. So I thought I would, lay out some of the things that haven't really changed as a result of this administration. I think it's easy to get caught up in kind of the sort of dramatic headlines from day to day, the latest scandal, the latest sort of thing that's happening. But I want to focus on a few things that haven't changed with respect to nuclear weapons, because I think some of them are actually quite consequential. Then I'll talk about a few things that I think have changed, and happy to sort of talk in more detail about any of them, depending on what you're interested in talking about. And then a couple of things that I think we don't know whether they've changed or not. So the first thing that I don't think has really changed is the US nuclear posture. Right, the modernization plan that John mentioned, was initiated in the Obama administration, but was in the works for a long time prior to that. And this is a massive modernization program of every leg of the US nuclear arsenal. Right, the sea leg, the submarines, the air leg, the bombers, and missiles. Right, and then the missiles, right? So, right, all aspects of the US triad are in the process of being modernized. And this is an enormously consequential and enormously expensive modernization program. So for all the sort of, talk about, maybe the Trump administration wants to, increase the size of the nuclear arsenal, it is just very difficult to go outside of the parameters that modernization program had already set. Right? There is just no appetite in Congress, as far as I can tell, for doing things beyond that capability. Nor is there any excess capacity in the US national labs or elsewhere in the US government bureaucracy for really developing, additional systems, large numbers of additional strategic or tactical weapons. The other way in which, I think the changes in the US nuclear posture have been over-exaggerated somewhat is that the recent nuclear posture review that the Trump administration put out was, although it contained some changes, or proposed some changes, it's less clear if any of them will actually happen. Nonetheless, that document was more or less in the mainstream of what any Republican administration, I think, would have put out. Now, that's not to say you could certainly debate whether that mainstream is a sensible place to be, but nonetheless, that is where the mainstream of Republican national security sort of professionals find themselves. There's relatively little in that document that I would not have expected from any Republican administration. And most of it, frankly, is not so different from, in terms of the substance of it, from what was in the Obama administration's nuclear posture review. Now, some of the tones were very different, right? And there were some changes, and I think, I have questions about whether some of those changes are sensible or worth the negative consequences that will come from them. So, for example, the proposal to have a submarine-launched or a ship-launched nuclear cruise missile, the possibility of having a low-yield option on submarine-launched ballistic missiles. I think both of these have significant problems associated with them, but they're not, such radical proposals in the context of the broad trajectory of US nuclear posture and the history of the US nuclear posture. The second thing that I don't think has changed yet, or that has changed somewhat less than people initially thought, is the Iran nuclear deal. Right? The Trump came into office saying this was a disastrous deal, the worst deal that the United States had ever negotiated. And he did recently, decline to certify that the deal was in the US national interest. What that essentially did was to sort of punt the issue to Congress. Congress then had a period of time to decide whether to reimpose sanctions on Iran that had been relieved as part of the deal. Congress has done nothing about that, right? And so therefore, the Iran deal is still being adhered to by both sides. It is still in force. Certainly Trump's actions in terms of refusing to certify that continuing in the deal is in the United States' national interest has, I think, bolstered those in Tehran who never wanted to sign a deal with the United States in the first place and who argued that the United States would not be willing to live up to any deal that it agreed to. But nonetheless, the Iran nuclear deal is still in place as things stand and does not appear to be going anywhere anytime soon. That may change, but it hasn't changed yet. The third thing that I think hasn't changed, that I think some people anticipated might change, is the broad contours of US non-proliferation policy. Right, if you look back at the history of US foreign policy since 1945, it's hard to argue that any issue has received as consistent a position in US foreign policy across Republicans and Democratic administrations than US non-proliferation policy. This has been something that the United States has been, with very few exceptions, wholly committed to throughout the nuclear era, right? Preventing both allies and adversaries from acquiring nuclear weapons. And during the campaign, right, Trump said various things that led people to believe that he might be the president who might change this, right? He made various comments that, you know, it wouldn't be that bad if Saudi Arabia were to acquire nuclear weapons, it wouldn't be that bad if Japan or South Korea were to acquire nuclear weapons. If that had come to pass, if that had represented what this administration was actually going to do, that would, in my view, have been the single most radical shift in US foreign policy that we would have seen in a long time. That said, it hasn't really come to pass, right? Both Mattis and Tillerson in their Senate confirmation hearings disavowed those comments. Mike Pence in one of the vice presidential debates denied that Donald Trump had ever said these things. And since the administration has come into office, there hasn't really been any indication that this administration is taking a position on non-proliferation that is much different to the position of previous administrations. So those are three things that I think haven't changed, or haven't changed that much, or haven't changed yet. Some things that I think have changed, right? Most obviously, right, the identity and the personality of the president have changed. And I think that's in large part the reason why a lot of areas in which there hasn't actually been a lot of change are nonetheless causing a lot more concern than they would have done in previous years, right? So we are seeing for the first time in decades serious discussions about the extent of presidential authority to use nuclear weapons. You know, for the first time since the 1970s, there were Senate hearings on this issue about the extent to which the president has the authority to use nuclear weapons. The answer to which, by the way, right, you know, if you want to know the extent of presidential authority on nuclear weapons, that extent is absolute. There is no one who can legally defy an order from the president to use nuclear weapons. The president may, of course, consult with, you know, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the Attorney General, whoever he wants to. But if the president gives an order to use nuclear weapons, the entire US bureaucratic system is set up to exercise that order within minutes. And that has been the case since the late 1940s. Right? I'm happy to talk about sort of the historical origins of that policy, but in a system that is, the US political system, right, in general is characterized by checks and balances. In the domain of authority to launch nuclear weapons, there are no such checks and balances. This is an area in which presidential authority is virtually absolute. And that means, right, that the identity and the personality of the president matters. You know, if we think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where you had a president who was restraining his generals and his advisors, their advice to invade Cuba, you know, I don't think many people think we have a president today who would play that role. Not only that, right, the president, you know, does not have much experience on these issues. He's surrounded by a lot of advisors who don't have much experience on these issues. And because the State Department has been increasingly hollowed out, you have a lot of vacant positions, right, I think there are very real reasons why people are concerned about this administration's ability to respond to a crisis if one were to happen. It's also clear, right, that this president has a unique relationship with others in the administration, right? This is a president who clearly distrusts his own intelligence community, is distrustful in a lot of cases of his own Secretary of State, does not make it clear who is speaking for him at any given time when foreign governments are negotiating with members of the administration. All of this, I think, has led to a greater concern about the Trump administration's ability to handle any potential nuclear crisis than we've seen in past administrations. So the second thing that I think has changed since the arrival of the Trump administration is North Korea's nuclear capabilities. Right? North Korea now, in my view, unambiguously has the capacity to hold US cities at risk with high-yield, sophisticated nuclear weapons. Right? They have now tested a genuinely intercontinental ballistic missile that can easily reach the entire continental United States and is so big that you wouldn't need to really miniaturize a nuclear weapon to get it on that warhead. And they've also tested a 150 kiloton nuclear device. This is not the kind of simple, low-yield device that North Korea had previously tested. This is a device that, if you exploded it in downtown Minneapolis, would kill potentially 400,000 people. Right? This is either a boosted fission weapon or a two-stage thermonuclear weapon, both of which are difficult things to design. Right? These are technologies the United States didn't master until the 1950s. North Korea now has these capabilities and has unambiguously demonstrated these capabilities. What this means, right, is some people are still quibbling, right, over, well, maybe North Korea hasn't yet demonstrated the ability to launch a missile that can deliver a nuclear warhead and survive re-entry. Right, this is clutching at straws. This is not a major technological challenge that any prior nuclear state has had any difficulty getting over once you have the nuclear weapon and the warhead and the missile to put it on. So, the conclusion should be, in my view, North Korea has the capability to hold United States cities at risk, and US officials do themselves no favors by casting doubt on North Korea's nuclear capabilities. Right? The way to, if you want to push North Korea to demonstrate the ability to have a re-entry vehicle survive re-entry, well, they can probably do that, right? But that means conducting an atmospheric nuclear test over the Pacific, and I'm not sure anyone should be pushing North Korea to do that. So what does this mean? I mean, it means, in my view, that denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is off the table. Any war with North Korea, in my view, today will be a nuclear war. For all the talk of, a bloody nose strategy, this idea that you can conduct limited military options on the Korean Peninsula, I think is pretty fanciful. And the reason it's pretty fanciful is that if you're North Korea, it is very hard to imagine being convinced that that any military action the United States takes has limited objectives. Right? So the idea of a bloody nose strike, right, is that you could take some limited action against North Korea. North Korea would recognize that this was limited and therefore would not escalate to nuclear use. Well, if you're North Korea, how do you distinguish between a limited bloody nose strike and the first strike before your head is chopped off? Right? These two things would look virtually identical, and given the way the United States wages war, right, the sort of strategies the United States uses in the opening moves of conventional war, North Korea is going to be under very significant pressures to use its nuclear weapons early in the conflict because it will not be given the chance to use them late in a conflict. So if you attack North Korea, you put their nuclear weapons, you put their decision makers under very strong pressures to use them or lose them, and in that circumstance, I would bet good money that North Korea would use them. So if denuclearization, therefore, should be off the table, in my view, war with North Korea should be off the table, in my view. What does that mean? I mean, to me, it means that the United States needs to exercise some modesty, right? It has to accept that US policy in the region around the Korean Peninsula is now constrained. In the same way that US foreign policy towards Russia is constrained today, in the same way that US policy towards China is constrained today, as a result of the fact that they have nuclear weapons. And the question is whether the United States is prepared to accept that its foreign policies are constrained in the region. I don't think we know the answer to that yet. But if the United States, in my view, tries to take military action against North Korea or tries to denuclearize North Korea, the United States will have to accept that North Korea can make the United States pay a very heavy price for attempting that. But, you know, the positive news, in my view, is that deterrence can work. We've been deterring North Korea for 70 years. There's no reason to think that Kim Jong-un is uniquely undeterrable. North Korea is no more of a rogue state than China was when it acquired nuclear weapons. In fact, it's much less of a rogue state. It's arguably less of a rogue state than the Soviet Union was when it acquired nuclear weapons. Both of these cases, didn't like it, but the United States came to understand that it had to accept that these countries had nuclear weapons, and that you could nonetheless deter the sort of actions that you were most worried about, right? And I think today there's no reason to think that the United States cannot deter North Korea from invading South Korea. There's no reason to think the United States cannot deter North Korea from using nuclear weapons. There's no reason to think that the United States cannot deter a sort of bolt out of the blue attack from North Korea. Nonetheless, that's the second thing that I think has changed in meaningful ways is North Korean capabilities. The third thing that I think has changed in meaningful ways is allied trust in the US. And this has two components, both a sort of affinity for the United States, right? A feeling that the United States is a country that allies like, but it's also about allies' beliefs that the United States is actually prepared to fight on their behalf, right? A lot of the sort of rhetoric from the Trump administration and from Trump himself, right, has been to denigrate the value of US alliances, to talk about US allies free riding on them, to say that US allies owe them huge amounts of money. And so allies, I think, are not unreasonably, therefore, questioning whether the Trump administration is actually committed to those alliances. What that means, I think, is that in the future, you may start to see, and I think you're already starting to see signs of this, US allies becoming interested in their own nuclear weapons again. And I say again because this was a perennial feature of the Cold War. And some of this has nothing to do with Donald Trump, right? This is the United States military power, relative power at least, is declining as China rises. And so particularly US allies in Asia, I think, would inevitably be questioning the reliability of US extended deterrence, US military commitments, even in the absence of Trump. But some of it is very much to do with Trump and things he's said and things his administration has said. So I think you're starting to see, conversations or more mainstream political discussion within South Korea, within Japan, within Europe, within Saudi Arabia, about the possibility of these countries acquiring their own nuclear weapons at some point. And I think we're still a long way from this happening, but this is much less implausible than I think it was a year ago or 2 years ago. What this means is that this may start to test the Trump administration's commitment to non-proliferation. Right? I mentioned at the start that the US non-proliferation policy hadn't really changed that much. That the US still seemed to be opposed to other countries getting nuclear weapons. But if some US allies start to become more interested in nuclear weapons, right, or nuclear, sort of more ambiguous nuclear capabilities, it will be interesting to see how the Trump administration responds to that, whether the Trump administration takes a more tolerant view of allied proliferation than prior administrations have done. So then lastly, one thing that I think we don't know the extent to which it's changed, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, is the US ability to respond to crises. This is an administration that has not yet, in my view, had to deal with a significant international crisis. And the general lack of experience of people in the White House, the president, people around him, I think at least raises significant concerns about if there were to be a genuine international crisis, right? A US adversary or that really decided to test the United States on some issue. I think we just don't know whether this administration has the capacity to sort of make decisions in a sort of timely, strategic fashion. And this is hampered by the sort of hollowing out of the State Department that has occurred, and the significant numbers of resignations and exodus from within the US intelligence community. Right, just the other day, the State Department's long-time sort of point person on North Korea announced that he's resigning at the end of this week. There's no ambassador in South Korea while all this stuff with North Korea is going on. And all of this, I think, raises questions, both in the United States and among US allies, right, that exacerbate all of these concerns, right? Make it less clear that allies will trust the United States going forward and rely on the United States going forward. So those, I think, are the sort of some things that haven't changed, some key things that I think have changed, and some things that I think we're still agnostic about. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. I think I'll take the privilege of the moderator role for a second and maybe ask John if you have thoughts about Mark's comments, and in particular, I think the impetus for the panel today was certainly kind of the escalation of tensions with North Korea over the past 6 months, and I think we should certainly open it up to discussing other potential challenges and nuclear threats as well, as John was mentioning. But I wonder, John, if you might want to comment from your perspective, from kind of a journalistic perspective, and in your conversations with policymakers and other contacts, kind of about thinking about about this current kind of escalation with North Korea, and thinking about some of Mark's comments about how to understand that. And in particular, maybe thinking about both of you raised this question about the Trump administration's ability to deal with crises, and perhaps maybe we might not think of the current situation with North Korea as quite a crisis yet, but certainly there's been escalation over the past 6 months with missile tests and testing of nuclear weapons, and UN resolutions strengthening the sanctions regime against North Korea, and certainly Trump's back and forth with North Korea on this issue. So I'm wondering if you might have kind of thoughts about this from your perspective about, what are the policy options available? How can we think of the ability of the Trump administration to carry out a policy of deterrence effectively, and yet to do so while de-escalating the kind of current crisis with North Korea? And then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience as well.
Well, thank you, and in general, I concur with Mark's well-expressed comments. And when I mentioned that, in general, nuclear posture and policy is a rare underhyped issue, in particular, the threat of warfare with North Korea is what I've heard from experts again and again. that the public isn't as focused on. And by that, certainly a potential nuclear conflict, which I think you're quite right, from all the reporting I've done on this and the experts I've heard, could quickly spiral into that, particularly because, as you mentioned, the uncertainty in Pyongyang, if a bloody nose becomes a broken jaw, becomes decapitation, as you mentioned, and the impossibility of them being able to read into that. And I think you need to look no further than Secretary Mattis, who has testified that even a conventional conflict between South and North Korea, with the United States, of course, heavily involved, would be, quote, the worst fighting that most people have seen in their lifetimes. So it's important to note also that, beyond what happens in Washington and Pyongyang, you also have Seoul and Tokyo at minimum who are involved in this. And, South Korea, partly reflecting a particularly sordid story of scandal coming from the previous administration, elected a new president who had favored the sunshine policy, who, as we just saw with the Pyeongchang Olympics, was clearly focused on reaching out to the North quite successfully. And now comes the hard part. It wasn't easy to reopen up the hotline and to get North Korean hockey players, to join their South Korean cousins, to play in the tournament. It's much harder to get to the more difficult issues that await here. And yet there is a dialogue that's going on, and there is not in any sense an appetite in South Korea to take part in any kind of bloody nose strategy. And even here in Washington, as most of you perhaps followed, when there was talk that Victor Cha, a name that maybe most of you know from following these issues, was going to be nominated to be ambassador to South Korea after an embarrassing and long absence, as we've seen in multiple global capitals regarding this administration. He lost that potential post because he publicly disagreed with the bloody nose strategy. And so when I talk about how multiple sources have told me that they think the public is actually underestimating the willingness of the administration to actually consider this. Now, regarding the other portion of the question, which I appreciate in terms of the administration's ability to handle a foreign policy crisis, I concur that they truly have not faced one yet. They've hardly faced a domestic policy crisis. Certainly events and deep and profound challenges, including the ongoing debate about what to do about our gun violence problem in this country. But perhaps in a crisis is where more experienced hands would be able to emerge. As you were all aware, President Trump has surrounded himself with Generals Kelly and McMaster and Mattis and others who perhaps take a little bit more of a clearer-eyed view of this. And so I think the optimistic outlook would be, if something did come to a head, that the president actually may listen more, defer more, and act upon their advice. There's nothing that demonstrably proves that, and in fact, there's ample evidence, as you mentioned before, that he's willing to undercut some of those figures, particularly with Secretary Tillerson. When your top envoy is in the field and you're tweeting, that he is wasting his time, that would be the textbook definition of a mixed message from an administration, in that perspective. Finally, I'll just add, I'm going to Tokyo next week on a reporting trip. That's going to be a little bit more economically and infrastructure focused. I went a few years back as Shinzo Abe and his administration were considering some of the constitutional changes that in our purview were quite minor, and those that were clearly supported by the Obama administration and certainly the Trump administration in terms of what they would call collective self-defense. And the extraordinary, almost existential debate that existed in Japan was profound and reassuring in a way in how seriously the Japanese citizens still consider these issues despite generations of a post-war environment that they have been. And clearly there's very little to no appetite for any kind of preemptive conflict in Japan as well. And the possibility, as has been pointed out to me and multiple experts that I've spoken to, clearly exists that one of the first moves that Kim Jong-un might make beyond towards Seoul, of course, is towards Tokyo and other parts of North and South Korea and the region. And to the degree that they get a vote in this as well, the vote would decidedly be for diplomacy. And so certainly it's my thought and hope that at least is the direction that they go. And then, of course, the compromises are going to be difficult and deep and unwelcome, but probably necessary.
Okay, let's turn it over to the audience. If you have questions for our panelists, and I'll just call on people and maybe just introduce yourself to the panelists and let them know who you are. John?
Hey there, my question is for Professor Bell. Hey there, Professor Bell. My name is Jonas. I'm a student here at Humphrey, studying global policy. Earlier in your presentation, you were talking about what hasn't changed, and you said the broad contours of the U.S. nuclear non-proliferation values and policies have not changed. But then you also said U.S. Is modernizing all its nuclear capabilities. I'm just wondering how you think the U.S. can justify that to the rest of the world, and how they can, reconcile those two. They seem like they contradict each other.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, go ahead. I think we have a small enough group that we can manage it. And just quickly, Sherry, 5, in terms of timing, go till.
I have no idea.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I'll just keep an eye.
Deep drop from exhaustion.
Okay.
Yeah, so, I think there has always been, right, the United States is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty obligates or obligates all the nuclear weapon states to work in good faith towards nuclear disarmament. And certainly a lot of countries around the world look at what the United States is doing in terms of modernization and say, the US is not committed in any meaningful way to nuclear disarmament. I think that's right. The United States is not really committed to nuclear disarmament. Neither are any of the other nuclear weapon states. It has always been a sort of debatable question whether nuclear modernization counts as violating the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In some sense, it's sort of an academic question because all the nuclear armed states are in the process of modernizing their nuclear weapons. And the United States position has always been, and is today, that actually, modernizing the nuclear arsenal is part of its commitment to disarmament because it's important to keep US nuclear weapons safe, it's important to keep them reliable, and that, there would be, the consequences of, US nuclear weapons sort of rusting and becoming less reliable and, not being clear if they work anymore, right? Would be deeply problematic and destabilizing in all sorts of ways. So, I don't think, I think when US allies and other countries around the world look at sort of the nuclear landscape, I don't think US nuclear modernization is one of the top things they worry about. I think this is a very big, ambitious modernization plan, but it by itself does not fundamentally alter the US nuclear posture, right? It doesn't fundamentally change the role that nuclear weapons are playing in US grand strategy, and it doesn't significantly alter the numbers of nuclear weapons that the United States has. So, I think in general, it's not to say that other countries don't care about it, but I think they worry much more about other things than they do about US modernization. And therefore it's not, for the United States to continue that modernization program, I don't think it has a huge political cost around the world.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I missed Mr. Rash's comments, but Mr. Bell, what about the Chinese? No one has, since I've been here, no one's mentioned anything about China and China's role, and it's right next to North Korea, and it's got huge numbers of troops over there, and if we would decide to do some kind of surgical process where we thought we could, take out North Korea's nuclear capabilities. China is, 40 miles away? We're, 2,000 miles away. Could both of you comment on China and its role in this whole process?
I spoke with Douglas Paul this week, who is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's top expert on China. And I was writing about the plan to lift limits on presidential terms and in effect ensconce Xi Jinping as president for life. And so among part of the discussion was to the degree that this could or may change any bit of Beijing's posture towards Pyongyang and towards this whole crisis. And he, as well as many other experts that I have spoken to, not in defense of Xi Jinping and the Chinese government, but really seem convinced that their leverage is more limited than any of us in here, or perhaps the world, think or hope. And in fact, there, on a personal level, there's never been a meeting between the two leaders. On a policy level, while of course China is North Korea's only true ally and outlet, that the fear of a refugee crisis on China's southern border, and more long-term and profound, the fear of being encircled, which is Henry Kissinger and others, regardless of what one thinks of Henry Kissinger, have written extensively about, is an incredibly long-term fear of China feeling encircled, of having a unified Korea under the auspices of Seoul with U.S. troops on their border like that, transcends their fear of an unstable southern neighbor that they have. That is not to say that China doesn't want to have this problem solved. It's deeply destabilizing. They, of course, don't want to see conflict on their border. And, before we all came in here yesterday, President Trump announced new tariffs on aluminum and steel. And as I quickly looked, the stock market was down 500 before I came in here. One can only imagine the geoeconomic consequences of some kind of conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And of course, China is extraordinarily invested in all of that, literally and figuratively, and so they want to avoid that as well. But my sense is, and I'd love to hear your thoughts here as well, but is that while China is a necessary component of solving this peacefully, they unfortunately are not the sole component unless they took a radical step, which probably would trigger a refugee crisis, maybe the lesser of the two evils for them, but certainly something that they're trying to avoid.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, just a few sort of additional thoughts. I think the question of whether China would intervene in a war on the Korean Peninsula, I think is very uncertain. I don't have a good sense for that. I don't think, I don't know if US officials are talking to Chinese officials about that, and in some ways I hope they are, but I genuinely don't know, right? And this is, of course, what happened in the original Korean War, right? The United States invades in response to North Korea's invasion of South Korea. China basically says, don't come close to our border, we will intervene. The United States doesn't believe that, goes right up to the Yalu River, and China does intervene, right? And the United States is then forced to spend several years fighting the Korean War to a sort of a bloody stalemate. The question of Chinese leverage over North Korea, I think, as John mentioned, is massively overstated in sort of popular discussions. This idea that China can solve this question if it wanted to, that China just has to try harder to persuade North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, is just untrue. And in fact, one of the reasons that North Korea has nuclear weapons is precisely so that it does not have to take orders from China, right? They have nuclear weapons precisely to preserve their autonomy and their independence. And the idea that China could, persuade them to give up their nuclear weapons, I just think is untrue. Even if China, were to threaten to abandon North Korea, right? Threatened to completely cut off, basically everything to North Korea. My personal view is that in that situation, North Korea would prefer to lose its ally than to lose its nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are the thing that Pyongyang views as guaranteeing its survival, right? They look out over the last 20 years of history, they see what happened to Saddam Hussein when he was in the United States crosshairs without nuclear weapons. They see what happened to Gaddafi when he was in the United States crosshairs without nuclear weapons. They see what happened to Ukraine in Russia's crosshairs without nuclear weapons, and they conclude that if you want to deter the most powerful military state to have ever walked the earth, nuclear weapons may be the one thing that you have that might make the United States think twice. And so, I just don't think, given that strategic environment and the value that they therefore put on nuclear weapons, that any amount of Chinese leverage is going to persuade them to give them up. And that's why I think denuclearization is off the table. The other reason, right, is that for China, North Korea is, although China would prefer North Korea does not have nuclear weapons, they also to some extent view the status quo as a sort of least bad option, right? It's not, they can live with the status quo. And actually all the participants in the region can live with the status quo. South Korea, for all the talk of, the potential value that, a unified Korea might have, South Korea doesn't want to pay the price of bringing the North up to the living standards of the South. China doesn't want a US ally on its border. And North Korea obviously has no interest in being unified under Seoul's control. So, all three of those actors, are more or less willing to live with the status quo of a nuclear-armed North Korea. And so the question is whether the United States is prepared to. Just one other thing on a different aspect of China that hasn't been raised is China's nuclear posture. I think what you're seeing is, in the same way that the United States is in the process of modernizing its nuclear arsenal, and Russia is modernizing its nuclear arsenal, China too is modernizing its nuclear arsenal. China has historically always had a very limited nuclear posture, right? Way fewer nuclear weapons than either the Soviet Union or the United States. And that shows no sign of changing. But as the United States develops more offensive capabilities that might be able to go after China's nuclear weapons, right? More what we call counterforce capabilities, right? The ability to target China's nuclear weapons in the first stages of a conflict. China is modernizing its weapons to ensure that it has a survivable second strike capability that would guarantee its ability to retaliate even in the aftermath of the nuclear attack. And so, although China's nuclear posture is not changing, some of China's capabilities are developing.
Yeah, hi, I'm Chuck Colloquium, student here at Humphrey School. I'm curious to know from either of you really, it just recently came out the UN saw that North Korea had been essentially shipping chemical weapons technology to Syria. I'm curious if there's been any concern or talk about North Korea exporting their nuclear weapons technology to other states or actors like ISIS or anything like that.
There's definite concern. I think it's a terrific question. There are sadly so many ways in this modern mechanized era to kill, and the transfer of chemical weapons technology, if not materials, is something that so many policymakers are quite concerned about. And one need just look back at the cases, the classic case of A.Q. Khan and the proliferation of technology that came out of Pakistan, and arguably there perhaps were more controls or less malevolence at the time coming, at least from the official government, than there might be, and also maybe less of a need for hard currency, which, as we all know, there's extraordinarily little that North Korea produces that the world wants, and that they do produce is extraordinarily sanctioned and difficult to export it at this point. Doing this on the black market is a way that they can keep some badly needed cash coming into the system there. So I do think that this is part of the discussion. from an optimistic perspective, may concentrate the minds of Security Council members who, look at this as a way that might exacerbate some of the conflicts in the Mideast, although of course you have the dynamic that, if this is being sent to the Assad regime, Russia is part and parcel, of that, the main sponsor, protector of Bashar Assad, and so, they might be able to thwart any kind of coercive action that might take place at the United Nations. But it's a really significant concern, and one can only imagine if the willingness to do that with chemical weapons, what might be willing to do with really bad actors regarding nuclear technology.
Yeah, I would more or less agree. I mean, I think the evidence suggests that the nuclear reactor in Syria that the Israelis bombed in 2006 had been sold to the client by the North Koreans. And as John mentioned, right, North Korea does not have a lot of exports. And one of the things they're good at is building missiles, building reactors, and it's not particularly surprising that they might be tempted to sell those. As John also mentioned, right, this is not a new policy concern for the United States. This is also something that the United States has experience dealing with in the case of Pakistan and the AQCAR network that sold nuclear technologies to Iran, to North Korea, to Libya, potentially one other customer that remains unknown. This I think is an argument for, there's been a lot of talk about what are the circumstances in which the United States might be willing to talk with North Korea. And you've seen sort of extraordinarily mixed messages from the Trump administration on this, right? You've seen sometimes they've said, we're willing to sit down and talk about the weather, if that's what you want to do, right? We're basically willing to talk about anything. At other times, other administration officials have said, we're not willing to talk unless North Korea either agrees to denuclearization or makes some costly signal of its willingness to actually go through with denuclearization. One of the reasons I think this is sort of damaging is that there are, even in the absence of any sort of rhetorical commitment by the North Koreans to denuclearize, I think there's an awful lot of things that the United States and North Korea could profitably talk about. And one of those, including nuclear weapons safety, nuclear materials security, future tests of nuclear weapons, future tests of missiles, institutionalizing various avenues of communication that could be used in a crisis. But one of the other important things that I think could be usefully talked about is trying to ensure that North Korea does not sell nuclear technologies to other states. I worry a little less about them giving nuclear weapons to terrorists. That just is not something that the North Korean regime has historically shown any interest in doing. Which is not to say it couldn't happen, but I think it's the lower probability of the two possibilities. But this is, to me, the reason why, or one of the reasons why the United States and North Korea should be talking to try and prevent this sort of thing from happening, even in the absence of any sort of commitment to denuclearization on the part of the North Korean regime.
One real quick addendum to that, you're quite right about the mixed messages regarding, we'll talk about the weather, or we won't talk unless it's directly about denuclearization. At times, those have come from the same individual. I think Secretary Tillerson, in this case, he's responding to President Trump's tweets or personal directives, and so, one can imagine that North Koreans, as well as leaders in other capitals, really, do not sense that the Secretary of State is calling the shots of the administration, and so they're going to be slow to respond until they really do get a sense of where the president is on these issues.
I just want to ask you both a really quick follow-up that brings together these last two questions. Can either of you speak to whether kind of China is talking with North Korea about issues of nuclear safety and kind of preventing accidents or kind of safeguarding their materials or anything like that? I don't know if there's any information about what we're talking about.
I don't know the answer. I don't really know the answer. I would suspect that such conversations are hard to have, right? And for the same reason that the United States finds them hard to have with countries like Pakistan, right? Pakistan is very unwilling to talk with the United States about things to do with securing its nuclear weapons because Pakistan believes that if the United States had half a chance, it would, right? The more information Pakistan gives to the United States about the security of its nuclear weapons, the more likely it is that at some point in the future the United States might attempt to take out Pakistan's nuclear weapons. And I would imagine that the North Korean regime has similar concerns. Certainly wouldn't with respect to the United States, but I would guess would have similar concerns with respect to China as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was an obstacle to conversations between China and North Korea on that issue.
Yeah.
So I'm David Reitz. I'm a PhD student at the Humphrey School. I really liked your analysis, Mark, and I guess the one thing I would quibble with, and I want you to respond to kind of the logic that I posed for you, is that the U.S. puts tremendous amounts of energy into the reliability of their weapons in a warfighting context, right? So how they're launching those pieces. In fact, we're upgrading the B-61 to 12. I mean, that's a gravity bomb, right? Those are weapons that undergo very little stresses. And so I would quibble with this idea that it is not useful to think about the reliability of that weapon on an ICBM. And the reason I think that's important is it helps us understand the potential future of North Korean actions. The second scenario that you talked about, actually it's the first scenario you talked about, that the North Koreans would likely respond with nuclear weapons if they thought that there was a threat to the regime, right? That they would launch them. It doesn't change that calculus at all, right? If they got it, whether it's 50% likely to work or 90% likely to work, it's going to go right in that scenario. In the other scenario, though, the bolt on the blue scenario that you talked about deterrence on, it really matters for that, right? If they think their weapon is only 50% reliable in a real warfighting context versus 99% reliable, you make a very different decision about the survivability of your regime or about even using that in the bolt on blue. And so I think that's one reason why some of us are still thinking about what happens with the reliability of those weapons in a warfighting context, and also potentially might help us evaluate the next test. So if there is another nuclear test and it's of a very similar yield to the last one, so there's been a ramping up of the yields. If it's a similar yield to the last one, it's likely that it was done under less than optimal conditions, right? A vibration platform, something that would simulate some of the stresses that a weapon would undergo during an ICBM delivery. That makes you think that that's the thing they're testing versus a much larger weapon or a smaller weapon, something of that nature. So love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing, and the way that the North Koreans are conducting their tests suggests that they are very interested in ensuring that they could use these nuclear weapons even under some degree of attack, right? So a lot of the missile tests are conducted at night, right, precisely to ensure that they could, because it would be easier to move assets at night without them being detected, right? And so they do that precisely to practice how they might use nuclear weapons in a conflict. Sure, right, it is not the case that there are no technological challenges associated with increasing the reliability of these weapons when they're on an ICBM. My only point is that for a country that has now mastered either a boosted fission device or a two-stage thermonuclear device, for a country that has the capability to do that, getting it onto a missile that can, get back into, that can hit a target and explode reliably should not be beyond their capabilities. And, no other nuclear weapon state has found it beyond their capabilities.
Well, we don't know. I mean, technically,
Sure.
Tell me who has,
yeah,
right?
But it's interesting too. You've seen some statements from the United States saying, or from U.S. officials saying, well, North Korea hasn't demonstrated capability X on its ICBMs, when capability X is something that U.S. ICBMs don't have, right? And so I think what this is a U.S. officials are understandably very reluctant to say, yes, North Korea has the capability to hold the United States at risk. right? Precisely because so many US officials have placed a red line, right, and staked their credibility on preventing North Korea from reaching that capability. And so, it's not surprising that that US officials would seek to downplay North Korea's capabilities, but if North Korea doesn't have that capability, this is not something we should be anticipating would take them a substantial amount of time to solve. I just don't, and it's not something that we've sort of demanded, so to speak, of any other nuclear armed state, that they demonstrate the ability to sort of have reliable re-entry vehicles, right? The only way to test that is with an atmospheric nuclear test, and the United, we haven't seen one of those since the 1980s, and the US certainly shouldn't be encouraging North Korea to do that.
Thank you. I'm Alan Carlson. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. And my question is a little broader. We've seen Global Zero, ICON, a number of other international non-governmental organizations which get the support of a lot of nation states who, looking at what you said, Mr. Bell, that the nuclear weapon states are not complying with the NPT. They're not making steps toward nuclear zero, to get rid of nuclear weapons. Global Zero and ICON are very vocal, but do you see them having any leverage on the nuclear weapon states? And where is that leverage, and how is that going to be developed over the coming years?
Yeah, so I think at the moment, I think that, right, so ICAN, which won the Nobel Peace Prize recently and was sort of the driving force behind the nuclear ban treaty that a lot of countries signed. I think as things stand, they don't have a lot of leverage over the United States. But they are in the process of trying to generate that leverage. And the way they are trying to generate it is on US allies. US allies who are not non-nuclear US allies who are under the US nuclear umbrella. I think what you're seeing is a lot of pressure on, or a lot of effort to try and build up a sort of grassroots organization in countries like Sweden, Norway, Japan, right, to pressure these countries to, even if not to sign the treaty, to at least acknowledge that this is sort of a movement that needs to be seriously engaged with. And so, it's not surprising that this movement has not yet been particularly prominent in the United States, because the United States is sort of the hardest target for them, right? Their plan is to sort of peel off US allies first, and so I think that's where you're likely to see the sort of bulk of their effort in trying to persuade US allies to either sign on to the treaty, or at least to make them pay a political price domestically for not signing on to the treaty. And we'll see where it goes. I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical of whether it's going to really go anywhere, but I may be wrong.
I'll just very briefly add that I wrote about ICAN when they won the Nobel Peace Prize, and I analyzed the history of who had won throughout the years. And Nobel Peace Prizes can certainly seem quick, if not quixotic, in terms of whom they're awarded to. And yet, if you look at the history, often they're very ahead of the curve in terms of, Franco-German relations, which are warmer than they have been in quite some time, and all the way back into, even during the pre-war years, there was an effort to reflect those who were focused on those. And as we all know, there have been extraordinarily successful efforts reflected in Nobel Peace Prizes, to ban landmines and chemical and biological weapons. And so, while I share the skepticism of many, including here in this room and in the panel, that they're going to have an outsized influence on this debate, I think their involvement in the debate is important. It's a moral conscience, and the eventual goal of having a world of non-proliferation won't happen unless you have groups and unless you have recognition like this. However, difficult or far off that it may seem. So, I at least can consider, the Norwegian Nobel Committee consistent in terms of looking, to the future, and hopefully they'll be prescient as they were with some other groups.
Are there other questions from the audience?
Aaron Mornimi, undergraduate in political science, and with Professor Bell's more annoying pupils. If, in light of Professor Bell's view of the realities of North Korea's nuclear capabilities, and if we were to take the optimistic view articulated by Mr. Rash of President Trump's relationship with his generals, Mattis, Kelly, McMaster, Utal, and the degree to which he relies on them, what, if anything, does that tell us about this administration's ability to act in a constrained manner around the Korean Peninsula and to adopt a position of deterrence, particularly in a restrained manner? Because, and then in regards to what you said about the hollowing out of the State Department, as the colloquialism goes, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I was just wondering if either of you had any thoughts on that.
I'll quickly say, I think when the history of this administration is written, one of the chapters that I think will be quite compelling is, are we indeed experiencing, although not completely aware of, the restraints that are being shown? Meaning, emotionally and impulsively, does President Trump want to indeed give North Korea a bloody nose or worse? And is he being restrained, in particular by General Mattis, as we're all well aware? He publicly has disputes with Secretary Tillerson, doesn't seem to have any kind of personal chemistry with General McMaster, but listens more to General Kelly, but particularly General Mattis, who may be telling him quietly and privately why this is an unsustainable idea, and maybe this is restraining him at this point. But it may be happening as we speak. I'm not sure.
Right. I mean, I think it's a lot of this is inevitably speculative because we simply don't know. I think a lot about what's going on in the administration, particularly although this administration leaks an awful lot, a lot of those leaks are deeply self-interested, and it's hard to always know exactly how reliable they are. I think it may, though, be worth distinguishing between some of these individuals. I think McMaster, everything we know about him suggests that he is pretty hawkish on these issues. And some of the things he has said publicly do not suggest a particular desire to restrain Trump on North Korea, right? He's been one of the more outspoken on sort of the undeterrability of Kim Jong-un, for example, all of which suggests that he would be more willing to run significant risks in order to attempt to sort of denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. Mattis, I think, is clearly on the other side, right? If you look at, and even in the New York Times today, right, a story about, or was it yesterday, I can't remember, about, that leaked in a lot of detail just how sort of horrific US sort of wargaming scenarios about the Korean Peninsula have been, even if, chemical or biological or nuclear weapons don't get used. This is not a fight that, is in any way comparable to, the invasion of Iraq, right? This is just, both in terms of the capabilities that North Korea has and the difficulty associated with getting injured American service members out of the Korean Peninsula, let alone American, the 100 or so thousand or 200,000, however many it is, of American civilians who are in South Korea at any given time. So it's pretty clear that people within the Pentagon are trying to push back against, or at least my interpretation is that people in the Pentagon are trying to push back against efforts to sort of make military options attractive. But one of the, I think one of the consequences of the absence of a US ambassador in South Korea has been that North Korea policy at least appears to be run out of the White House at the moment. And so I think it's it's an open question the extent to which Mattis is playing a restraining role given that. Now, it may be that ultimately, you know, if it gets to a point where it looks like a decision to use military action may be being made, then maybe at that point we will see the extent of Mattis's power. It may be that we simply haven't got to that stage yet. Or alternatively, it may be that actually behind the scenes McMaster is exercising a significantly restraining role. I think we just don't know at this point.
I'm Melanie Summer. I work here at the Humphrey School, and I have to confess that I looked at my Twitter feed a little while ago while you were talking. Sorry. But one of the things I noticed that NBC is reporting that McMaster is on the way out, that Mattis and John Kelly are trying to find a soft landing for him at the Pentagon, so he's probably going to be gone shortly. So does that much change what you were just describing?
I think it may do, it may not, right? If he's replaced by John Bolton, I think that would, that maybe moves things in the other direction. If he's replaced by someone else, I think, you know, it could be in the other direction. So, you know, it's hard to make a definitive assessment, given that A, we don't know exactly what effect he is having within the administration at the moment, and B, we don't know who he would be replaced by.
David?
I'm just going to make, so I first became aware of General Mattis when he was head of Joint Forces Command. And we received a memo. I was working for, in Honolulu at the time, and we received a memo saying that Joint Forces Command didn't want to hear the words effects-based operations anymore. And that was from Mattis's hand, memo written by him. And this bloody nose thing is a textbook example of an effects-based type operation. And so Secretary Mattis, from a long history, so we're talking a decade ago, has shown no love for that kind of believing that you can use a scalpel to try and take off something. And so I would say that's good evidence that he's able to do that. The other thing is that the Undersecretary of Defense policy, the nuke guy is a guy named David Trachtenberg, who takes nuke issues very seriously and is much more about U.S. capabilities than he is about believing that they can have non-proliferation. So it's really interesting to see kind of the rhetoric that's coming out from the White House versus, and sometimes from the State Department, depending on the way the wind is blowing at that day, and kind of what the serious people within the Pentagon kind of think.
So it looks like we're kind of reaching the end of the program. I just want to ask maybe to kind of set up perhaps some concluding remarks from both of you. And we've talked a lot about North Korea, which I think is appropriate given the current circumstances. But maybe we can pull back for a second in conclusion and turn back to some of the comments, John, that you made at the beginning about the other, we focus so much on North Korea, and yet there would be many other states that, and potentially non-state actors that are potential concerns in terms of nuclear proliferation. So I was wondering if either of you might want to comment, or maybe both of you could comment on, is there anything that we're not paying enough attention to that we really should, and perhaps should be more of a focus of kind of our conversation in the United States as a public or as a government in terms of thinking about nuclear policy going forward?
Well, first, thank you for the question. Thank you all very much for your questions and for taking part today and for the honor to take part in the panel. And my compliments to the comments from everyone here, and Mark in particular. In your thoughts, you mentioned a nation overlooked in this debate quite often, and that's Ukraine. And I think, beyond the lessons of Libya and Iraq, the lesson of Ukraine is not lost on those potential proliferators. We all can look back and remember, and I think they were the 5th largest nuclear force in the world with the dissolution of the Soviet Union a generation or so ago. They signed a very specific treaty guaranteeing their territorial integrity in exchange for relinquishing those nuclear weapons, and the Crimean crisis hit. Russia cleaved part of their country. The response from the West has been sanctions and, at times, uncertainty as to the extent and duration of those. And nations look at that, even a country that had that much nuclear power, and if they indeed give them up, and what happens. And I think that as we look towards the events of today, with what President Putin said in Russia in his re-election campaign, and about the upgrades that he is promising or believes he can deliver regarding nuclear policy here. It amplifies and exacerbates the desire of some nations to have nuclear weapons, which shows the uphill battle that I can and those that hope that they can indeed, contribute to the non-proliferation efforts face here. So I think that the necessity of keeping the pressure on regarding Ukraine beyond, the issue of Crimea also goes all the way back to, that original action taken by Russia.
So I'll just mention one thing that I think is going on at the moment that I don't think is getting much attention, which is that the United States is currently involved in a sort of, essentially an internal debate about the conditions under which it would be prepared to sell Saudi Arabia nuclear reactors, and whether the United States should insist upon what's called the gold standard in terms of commitments from the Saudis about the circumstances in which they would engage in reprocessing of plutonium or enrichment of uranium. And this is, I think, a really consequential debate for the future of the civilian nuclear marketplace and the potential risks of Saudi nuclear proliferation in the future. And it's largely happening sort of off the radar. And so that's something that I think more people should be paying attention to. It's happening right now. Right? Rick Perry was supposed to be going to India. It was instead is I think being sent to Saudi Arabia to sort of try and secure the sale of U.S. nuclear reactors to Saudi Arabia. The U.S. may be prepared to not insist that Saudi Arabia agree to the gold standard. I actually think there are pretty good reasons not to insist that Saudi Arabia meet those standards, but this is a very consequential debate that is happening well off the front pages.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists today, Rash and